Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. The Havdalah ceremony with which we mark the end of Shabbos and the beginning of the week, sung by the children of the Weber chorus. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Wishing you Shavua Tov, a good week, a good vach in Yiddish. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on this fine Saturday night? Paula Schmidt-Klauser from Chicago. Brinna Bloomfield says Shavua Tov from Sharon, Massachusetts. Gwen Strong with us from Michigan. Ed Berg from Egg Harbor in New Jersey. Pauline Michael from Arkansas. Hannah Rivka says Shavua Tov. Betty Whitehead, my other half, and me from Olivehurst, California. Sally Swick from the eastern shore of Maryland. Stephen Yorist from Oklahoma City. James Roth, I know, is with us from Indianapolis. Michelle Vizina Peterlin, Evansville, Indiana. Jonathan Hain, Minneapolis, Minnesota, says Shalom. Rachel Lee from Texas. Daniel Vizana from Peabody, Mass. Lauren Wolf Weisbaum says Shavua Tov. Janice Beanstalk is with us saying Shavua Tov. Lauren Wolf Weisbaum saying Shavua Tov from California. Ratul Emam is with us. Bill Eldridge says Shalom from Arkansas. Looking forward to unwinding from a stressful day with some relaxing study. If everybody could say that, wouldn't it be a better world? We're unwinding through study. Beautiful, beautiful. Sue Strauss in the house from Chicago. Sawara Javed also from Chicago. Stephanie Marie Diaz says Shavua Tov. Gary Kopachinski says Shalom. Richard Denson from Galveston, Texas. Hannah Keller Southern says Shalom from Mississippi. Mihaela Juliana is with us from Newmarket. Jason Lipstein says Shavua Tov, good health and blessings. Rafakul Islam Durjoy says hello. Mary Edna Barfield Taylor says Shalom from Michigan. And Elfric Sangma says hello. Over on the YouTube side, Deborah Hazelwood is with us from Florida. Welcome, everybody. We're starting a new week. Where are we? This is Eruvin Daf 20, Daf Chaf. We are on chapter 2, Mishna number 1, continuing our discussion. We've been talking about a well in the public domain and setting up corner posts around it so that we can draw water out of the well, even though the well itself acts as its own private domain because its sides are more than 10 handbreadths high, its area is more than 4 square handbreadths, and so it constitutes its own private domain. If we were to take water from it and we're standing in the public domain, then we've transferred on Shabbos from a private domain to a public domain, and that is a transgression. But by creating with partitions and enclosure around the well, so now we're taking from a private domain, which is the well, to another private domain which is not owned by anybody, and therefore that transfer is going to be good even though the whole thing is within the public domain. Now, we don't need a complete enclosure. We're going to be talking about that a little later. We don't need that complete enclosure. Just the corner posts around it will do, as we've seen in the figure a couple of times. And we can see it again here. And we're going to be discussing in a moment what's going on. But you can see there's a well in the public domain, and there are those corner pieces outside of it. And everything within those corner pieces is going to be valid. It's a private area that we can draw water into. Okay, now, previous to our discussion about the well, when we started chapter 2, we were talking about joining courtyards that empty into an alleyway and adjusting that alleyway so that we could carry on Shabbos. So now we're going to combine the concept of courtyards and the well with the corner posts. So we have a question. Abaye asks Rabba. Okay, so these are both sages living and working and studying in Babylonia in the Talmudic period. And Abaye says to Rabba, what if a courtyard opens into the area between the boards? And so that's what this figure really is meant to show. And I really love this drawing. So this is the book, Rabbi Abish, when he was filling in for me, he had the book itself. But thanks to Neil in Virginia, we have the PDF that he sent me. So this is from the book Hamahor Hamevohar. It's hard to pronounce. Hamahor Hamevohar. And these illustrations are wonderful. Even in the Koran Talmud, I think it can be a little bit confusing, right? When you're looking at illustrations like this. They're good. And in the art scroll, they're good as well. It's actually an area where in the art scroll, you have more illustrations than usual. But I like these color 3D illustrations even better. So the idea here is, you see, this is sort of like a typical living situation in Talmudic times. You had these courtyards with multiple buildings in them. And the people who live in those buildings, certainly they would create an eruv so that they could carry within their courtyard, right? It's a joint courtyard that is the property of both of those homes that are in that courtyard, separate from the other courtyards that adjoin them. So right now what we're talking about is the people in those two homes, they can carry throughout that courtyard. Now we have this situation where they've built an extension of their courtyard, and that extension, the door to it, is opening within the enclosure around the well in the public domain. I mean, this idea that it's asphalt with a white line down the middle, obviously that's not meant to represent what it looked like in Talmudic times, but it's to remind us that this is a public domain separate from that private property in their courtyard, right? So their courtyard opens into the public domain, but in an area within the corner posts that surround a well, a water well for drinking and drawing water. And the question is, so on Shabbos, is it going to be permitted for somebody to carry something from that courtyard out into the area around the well within the corner posts? Abaye asks Rabba this question. Rabba says, mutter, permitted. It is permitted to carry because this is going to be like one continuous area from that private courtyard that joins the two houses. They've made an eruv. Now, that kind of eruv, by the way, is something they needed to establish at some point. It's not just because both houses are in the private domain, but they would have made an arrangement. I think they put a little bit of food maybe in one of the homes, and they all symbolically agree that this joint courtyard is going to be joint property for the purposes of carrying on Shabbos. And now that permit to carry within their courtyard is going to extend out into that area that is an enclosure around the well. So Rabba says to Abaye in answer to his question, permitted. But then we get a second question. Abaye says, what if we have two adjacent courtyards and they both open into the area between those corner posts? So now we have this situation. So now we see that there are two courtyards, two neighboring courtyards. The only connection between those two neighboring courtyards is that they both have entrances into this enclosed area defined by the corner posts around the well. So, could a person carry an object out of one courtyard into the enclosure around the well, and then if this is permitted, he could continue walking into the neighboring courtyard and continue to carry that object? Is that permitted? Answer, according to Rabba, no. This is asur, it is prohibited. We don't want to create a situation where the special leniency that allows carrying around that well with only an enclosure made of corner posts to further serve to join those two courtyards. That's not allowed. That is not going to be permitted. Rava then says, Rav Huna says, and this is going to be prohibited even if they made an eruv together, if those two courtyards were otherwise joined, says Rav Huna. Rava says, no. If they made an eruv together, if they joined those two courtyards other than by use of the enclosure around the wells, then it's going to be permitted to carry throughout the two areas. And so you see in this figure here, they've got two entrances into the enclosure around the well. Let me get that there. Two entrances, one from each courtyard into the enclosure around the well. But you can see that there's also a separate door, an opening between the two courtyards that allows them to carry from one courtyard to another through that open doorway, through that entrance. So now we have a situation where two adjoining courtyards, each courtyard has to have at least two homes in it or more. So it's 4 homes minimum in 2 courtyards. They've already been joined with an eruv, right? They have a communal eruv in those 2 courtyards that have been joined together by virtue of that symbolic joining of the courtyards and the physical joining of the courtyards, which is that separate entrance between the 2 courtyards. Now it doesn't matter that they also have entrances out into the enclosure. They've already been joined, and so they're going to be free to carry not only between the courtyards, but also out into the area of the well and back. They can draw water from that well and bring it into either of the courtyards and into those homes. Abaye said to Rava, that's right. And there's a baraisa, right? So contemporaneous with the Mishna and other teaching. There's a baraisa that supports your ruling. It says that if there's the baraisa says if there's 2 courtyards that empty into this enclosure around the well, we cannot carry back and forth. But if they join in an eruv together, then we can. Exactly what Rava has said and what we've just been studying. And so then the Gemara asks, so then this must be a conclusive refutation of Rav Huna's position, because Rav Huna said that even if the 2 courtyards join in an eruv, it's not going to be permitted for them to carry when they have doorways out into the enclosure around the well. And then the Gemara answers, well, no, actually, Rav Huna could say to you that in that baraisa, it's referring to a situation where they might have had that doorway, but later they were joined into a better, more visible eruv. So what the sages are concerned about here, and what Rav Huna would be concerned about, is like you see this situation where the 2 houses have doors that go out into the enclosure, and even though they have that opening in the courtyard between them, we don't want the public to think that the reason people can carry from the well enclosure into the courtyards or even from one courtyard to another is because of the enclosure around the well. The reason they can carry from one to the other is because of that doorway. So what Rav Huna is saying is maybe it's a situation like this, where they had that doorway, and for Rav Huna, that doorway wasn't enough. So they went and did what they really needed to do, which is to breach the wall. Not just to have an entrance, but to literally, it's not just a doorway between them, but it's that they've literally joined the courtyard. So it's really not two courtyards now. It's one big courtyard because the wall between it was breached in a more significant way. That's how Rav Huna would look at this. But the law is that if they've joined in an eruv and it's considered a proper eruv, then we can carry back and forth between them. Okay, new question. So Abaye had been talking to Rabba. Now we're going back to the original question, was Abaye to his teacher, Rabba. So Abaye said to Rabba, what if we have one of these wells with the corner posts around it, and it's not a spring, which eternally is going to have water in it, but rather it's a cistern that catches rainwater, and the water runs out on Shabbos, right? They had water at the beginning of Shabbos, but the water dries up during Shabbos. Either they were just near the end of the water, or maybe something went wrong at the bottom of the well, something opened up, the water sank. Anyway, there's no more water. So now, can we carry in that enclosure, which was a leniency for the purpose of drawing water, but now there's no water? So Rabba answers him, no, we cannot. Now it's a sewer. Now it's prohibited. Because the only reason that we could carry in that enclosure defined by the corner posts is because there was water in the well. Now there's no water in the well. We cannot carry there. Remember, it's a leniency to say that this is a valid enclosure, which is only defined by corner posts. Normally, for an enclosure to be valid, it's going to have, probably 3 sides. There's going to be some rules about that, but certainly not mere corner posts. That's a leniency for the special case of water. And as we'll see tomorrow, in tomorrow's daf, we're going to talk about why they really needed to create that leniency around a well. The question will be, who does that well in the public domain serve? Is it for the purpose of animals, or is it for the purpose of pilgrims? Right? So pilgrims are the people making the festival pilgrimage up to Jerusalem 3 times a year. All the Jewish people are supposed to appear in Jerusalem for Passover, for Shavuos, and for Sukkot. But is that the reason? Because there's a lot of pilgrims coming through, is that why we're going to make this leniency? Or is it more for people on any Shabbos who live in the area to draw water for their animals? We'll talk more about that tomorrow. Okay, but the bottom line in terms of Rabba's answer to Abaye is those corner posts only define an enclosure we can carry in if there's water in the well. Ravin says, well, what? He says it to Abaye, right? So Abaye learned from his master Rabba. Later he's older and he's teaching, giving over these teachings that he learned from his master. And now his student, Ravin, says to him, well, what if, there was water in the well and it dried up on Shabbos, but later the water came back, right? So maybe it's the kind of well that is fed by some kind of underground stream, and it got blocked upstream for some reason, so there was no water in the well, and now we've just learned there's no water in the well, so now we can no longer carry there. But what if then that blockage goes away upstream, the water renews its flow, and now there's water again. So the water both dried up and came back on Shabbos, so may we carry there. Abaye says to him, well, you've already heard the answer, that if the water was flowing and then it dries up, so now we can no longer carry there. It's no good. Now the water comes back, and this is actually going to be a case where we're going to treat those partitions as if they were newly created on Shabbos. Obviously, those corner posts were erected before Shabbos. We can't put up the corner posts on Shabbos. But because the water dried up, Now they were considered as that's not a valid enclosure anymore. It's nothing. Now the water comes back, and it's as if, legally speaking, the corner posts were erected during Shabbos. So in that situation, says Abaye to his student Eruvin, we've already learned that that any kind of partitions, any kind of a wall or fence, which is erected on Shabbos, whether willfully or intentionally or accidentally or through no work of our own, they just somehow came into being on Shabbos, they constitute valid partitions. So even though they're new partitions on Shabbos, as if they were created on Shabbos, they will work to allow us to carry there. But Eruvin, who's a sharp student, reminds his teacher, well, wait a minute. Rav Nachman said to us that the fact that partitions which are newly created on Shabbos are valid partitions is only a decree of the sages to be held as a stringency. Meaning, if some kind of new enclosure was created on Shabbos and you throw an object into it, that's the example that's given, but it would be the same if you carried an object into it, so then you'd be liable for violating Shabbos because you carried something or threw something from the public domain into a private domain. So the fact that those partitions are valid on Shabbos, even if they came into being on Shabbos, whether intentionally or unintentionally, is only for the purpose of creating a stringency so that we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't create partitions on Shabbos. And the Gemara answers this objection and says that Eruvin is half right and half wrong. He's right that the sages instituted this as a stringency. So if you want to carry in an area on Shabbos and you think you can just, and you didn't have partitions there, so you said, okay, well, let's put some partitions there so that now we can carry, that's not going to work. If you intentionally build partitions to create a private domain on Shabbos, you will not be allowed to make use of those partitions in order to carry there, because the sages don't want us building anything, even putting something together on Shabbos. However, if those partitions came into being unwittingly, like a person didn't mean to, or perhaps, the contractor, the construction worker who put up the partitions didn't know it was Shabbos, so he didn't do it intentionally on Shabbos, it was somehow by mistake. Or if the wall, the partition in this case, sort of came into being spontaneously by itself through some other means than a person putting it up, then it will constitute a valid partition, not only as a stringency, but also as a leniency. In other words, we will be allowed to carry in that enclosure as long as it wasn't created intentionally to allow us to carry there on Shabbos. And so now I'm coming to the end, so if you have questions or comments, make sure you write them now because we're right near the end. So in this case, where the water dried up, there was a well, and it dried up on Shabbos, so then we could no longer carry in that enclosure. And then later the water comes back. And as Abaye tells us, this is treated as a case of new partitions that are newly created on Shabbos. And even though intentional partitions would not work for us to carry there, no one, made the water stop and then made the water come back. That didn't happen because of anybody's intentional interference in the situation, and therefore we would be able to carry and to draw water in that enclosure when the water comes back. And not only that, the halacha is that even if the well was dry when Shabbos began, but the partitions were there, so we can't carry in that well area. We can't draw water from that well on Shabbos. Well, we can't draw water because it's dry. But if the water arrives during Shabbos, even though it was dry at the beginning of Shabbos, as long as the partitions were also there at the beginning of Shabbos, then we would be able to draw water as soon as the water arrives in the well. So that's it. That's what we've got tonight. There's a whole other set of teachings on this daf that it was just too complicated. It's just too complicated. It's too complete. It's too subtly different and long explanations of the case of a trough that extends into the enclosure next to the well. And the question is, can somebody take a bucket of water and put it into the trough so that his animal can drink from it, even though the animal is standing in the public domain, in another domain, is just going to drink from the trough? That is permitted, but all he can do is put water in the trough. What's much more problematic is if you take the bucket of water and bring the bucket to the animal so it could drink directly. If you're interested in the rules of that, so you'll find it there on this daf, page 20 of Tractate Eruvin, the third volume of the Talmud. I think as a takeaway for what we're learning tonight, I think one rule to remember is this idea that in terms of having an eruv, there's always got to be intentionality about it, right? And so if you bring that intentionality after Shabbos has begun, the sages are going to say, no, that's too late, right? So during the week is when we make our arrangements to have a nice Shabbos. Once Shabbos is there, we don't start adjusting our space to make it better. We have the space that we created during the week, and for the rest, we just enjoy it as it is and trust in the enhanced spirituality that comes to us because we have that extra measure of soul on Shabbos, and we don't try to adjust our environment. And as we've learned many times in Tractate Shabbos, we don't make arrangements even that are going to benefit us next Shabbos, on this Shabbos, during Shabbos. We enjoy Shabbos, and we don't do anything to prepare for later. Okay, let's look at your questions and comments, if any. So Lynn in Texas. So we need the enclosure around the well to be big enough for a human or animal body to stand and drink. How can water be taken to the house? It's this situation, right? When the courtyard actually has an extension that goes into the enclosure around the well. Otherwise, it wouldn't work, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't work because you can draw water out and drink it right around the well within that enclosure. If you leave the enclosure, then, well, you've totally violated the whole purpose of the enclosure because you carried something from this well out into the public domain. But in the situation we talked about tonight, and as shown in this figure, right? So now the courtyard itself extends into the enclosure. So a person that draws water and takes it to his house never walks through the public domain, only goes from the enclosure around the well and then directly into the courtyard of his or her home. Second question from Bill Eldridge. I wonder, and this may be a question without an answer, when there are walls or partitions that came into being on Shabbos, particularly in the case of the intermittent cistern, as we've been talking about, who is the legal person who's responsible for the creation of the partition? Is it the well itself? Is it whoever built them before Shabbos? Who, as they say, done it? Legally speaking, that is. Well, I think that when we talk about the water coming back, there's no builder, right? Because the partitions themselves never changed. They're considered legally as if they came into being on Shabbos. But it seems to me that's a kind of legal understanding of that they're new partitions. And likewise, legally speaking, when the water comes back, that it was not intentional by anybody. What's interesting you could ask is, well, what if somebody blocked the water upstream and then unblocked it? Do they then become the legal creator of the new partitions? And then may anybody, is that person barred from using the well and drawing from it? Or is everybody barred? And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know what the answer to that is. But in this case, it seems like we're talking about it just naturally happened. No one is talking about any purposeful intervention. But, it's a good question, Bill. And so often what happens is, because this is a record of discussions by actual sages rather than a presentation by a professor, let's say, of a subject over the course of a 10-week semester, it's not that organized, right? So when you ask a question like that, maybe the answer is going to come in the future, and we don't have the answer yet just because it hasn't been presented in that systematic way. So often questions come up and it's like, well, this should have been presented before as they were establishing the basics of the idea before us. Like, normally if you're teaching, you would first establish the basics and then move on to more complicated cases. But in the Talmud, often we start with a more advanced and complicated case and only get to the basic rules a little later. So maybe we'll have that answer soon in our journey through Tractate Eruvin. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us tonight. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow. I have a long training tomorrow with our sort of local Jewish security force. But I'm pretty sure I'm going to be home in time to prepare and teach at the regular time, 6 o'clock. If not, it'll just be a little bit late. But generally speaking, we're targeting to be on at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, tomorrow, Sunday. Have a brilliant rest of your Saturday night and Sunday.